and welcome to Black Issues Forum. I'm Deborah Holt-Noel. So pleased to be here on the campus of Shaw University on the occasion of your MLK celebration, right here in the historic Esty Hall, and also right here at the founding home of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. So this is a very historic place, a historic time, and my guest today is a historic figure in his own right. His father, one of the foremost civil rights leaders, the Reverend Jesse Jackson. But right here today, I'd like to welcome and thank for coming Jesse Jackson Jr. So pleased to sit here with you. You addressed the audience a little bit earlier today. Today's theme is Awakening the Dream, but you talked about remaining woke through the revolution. What did you mean by that?
Deborah, I think that any purpose-driven life, particularly for students, it's to identify themselves within the context of their star. The stars will align in every student's life, only in that particular alignment for their life. The stars will never be the same again. And each student ultimately has to identify their purpose in the universe, their purpose in our struggle, their purpose. They have to contextualize their lives. An example, I was born March 11th, 1965. There's not a day of my life that escapes that reality. That's 3 days after Bloody Sunday, when John Lewis and Hosea Williams were walking across Edmund Pettus Bridge for the right to vote. That would lead to the Selma to Montgomery campaign. In fact, my father was in a large debate with my mother about what to name me. My mother wanted to name me Jesse Jackson Jr. My father wanted to name me Selma. Thank God my mama prevailed. But my parents positioned my life in the context of a star. And it is part of that struggle that I have identified with, that I have chosen to identify with. None of these young students at Shaw University can escape the fact that they were born in the Obama era, that they watched Obama as president, that they've lived in the Trump era, that they've seen the forces of reaction and resistance. They don't get to ignore that. That is a call to engagement. That is a call to direct action. It is an identification with themselves in their star. And that is part of being awoke. I walked across North Carolina A&T State University's campus between 1984 and 1987 in the aftermath of a promise given to the American people by our movement of inclusion, of little black boys and little white girls and little white girls and little black boys, and all of the rhetoric associated with an inclusive and tolerant America. And I've lived long enough at age 53 to see us now moving away from that dream. There has to be a recognition that we are in a star, that we are in a context, and that we don't get to ignore the cards that have been dealt us.
What do you see as the dream today, then?
I'm not giving up on the American experiment. There is no country like America in the world. We don't live in communist China. We don't live in fascist Russia. We don't live in the unorganized democracies of many African countries. We don't live in South American, a socialist context. We live in a country that dedicated itself to the idea that there was one God, that he is the author of life, and he is also the author of liberty. And through our struggle, the addition of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution, and 100 years after the addition of those rights to the Constitution, the struggle that we engaged in to make good on the 14th Amendment with the Civil Rights Act, to make good on the 15th Amendment with a Voting Rights Act and subsequent public accommodations legislation. In other words, we are part of a process. And that process, whatever your objections or concerns or criticisms of America are, there is no country in the world where we can fight for the right, where we can agree to agree and agree to disagree, whether it's positively heading in our direction or negatively heading against our very human liberties. But in America, we have the right to fight for the right. And that's what makes America so great. Every student and ultimately every person has to answer the question in their star. Dr. King would have celebrated his 90th birthday. And there is no doubt in my mind, and I don't think there's any doubt in those of us who are celebrants of his life, that he answered the questions and the star that he represented.
There's no doubt about that. And as I think about all of the young people who attend Shaw University, attend our HBCUs here in North Carolina, and really our African American students at large, what would you say the charge today is for HBCUs in the current social climate moving toward progress in this revolution?
I'm honored to be at Shaw. One of the reasons I enjoy speaking at HBCUs, really something my father told me when I agreed and decided to attend North Carolina A&T. Leadership is bred in a majority experience. Something happens between the ages of 18 and 21 that is really, really special in terms of the independence of their minds from their homes and the idea that they're no longer under the tutelage or under the umbrella of their mothers and their fathers. They are, to some degree, independent. They're on their own. When I was at A&T, we had an African-American chancellor, and I had African-American professors and African-American teachers, and there was no struggle for African-American inclusion on the faculty because guess what? We was all African-Americans. But there was something in my mind, Dr. Forbes, that clicked, that we can be PhDs, and we can teach classes. We can be chancellors of institutions. And that's different at the other institutions in North Carolina, from Chapel Hill to NC State. We're not in a majority experience. And so from Shaw comes SNCC. We were used to black SGA presidents and black homecoming queens and black presidents and chancellors of institutions and universities. We weren't debating whether or not a Negro could lead an institution. We're well past that debate. We're fighting for social justice. We're trying to desegregate buses in the community. We're beyond a campus dispute because we know who we are. That's different on some other campuses, where you spend all of your time trying to desegregate the faculty itself. So 18 to 21 is a critical stage in the development of leadership. And I recommend it for my own children that they attend HBCUs. And it's okay, NC State, Chapel Hill, Harvard, all those secondary institutions and lesser education institutions, do that for graduate school. But at the fundamental level that you identify with who you are as a person and respect for black people, there's no substitute for the HBCU. And I can tell you that with the remaining HBCUs that do exist, we still graduate collectively more baccalaureate degrees across this country than all of the white colleges combined. The black middle class in this country owes its success to the historically black colleges and universities.
Do you see today's HBCU students answering that call?
I see them as the most competitive, the most capable, the most qualified. I see them as a hybrid and a synthesis of two worlds. The synthesis of the street. When I went to A&T, I had a young cat sitting in one of my classrooms. Man, this guy sat in the back of the class, had his hat on, and I mean, he slept through Dr. Jones' statistics the whole semester. We sitting on the front row trying to figure out what it was that Dr. Jong was teaching us about normal distribution and about statistics. And one day, Dr. Jong didn't call on us. He called on the guy in the back of the class who had been sleeping and snoring over and over and over again. He said, no, I want you to come down here and do this question and provide the answer on this board. The young man came down after he woke up, cleaned the sleep out of his eyes, went on the board, completed it 4 different ways, and went back up to the top of the class and went back to sleep. Now, he could have gone to Harvard or Yale or anywhere else. And maybe he didn't have a mom at home. Maybe he didn't have a daddy at home. Maybe he came from a broken situation, which many of us come from and make our way to college. But what it taught me, having grown up in essentially a middle-class home with two middle-class and very prominent parents, was I couldn't look down on anybody. The guy we didn't want to sit by was the genius in the class. He couldn't go to school nowhere else. And there was genius that was amongst us. And it looked just like us. And we developed an appreciation for us. And everybody all skin folk ain't necessarily kinfolk. But you make no mistake about it, at A&T, we got to see who we were. At Shaw, these students get to see us at our best. Trust me when I tell you, when they graduate from college, they will see some of us. You don't have to go from college, you can see it on Facebook. They will see some of us at our worst. But when they graduate, they will see us at our best.
Let me pivot a little bit and turn to the 2020 election. You certainly have your experience as a former congressperson. And what do you think is key to making sure that we place leaders in place in 2020 who have the interests of the people in mind, who are truly representative of the people and needs of this nation?
Deborah, I think ultimately we're going to have to ensure that this democracy is more representative. We have to register our students to vote. We have to register our community to vote, because elected officials are not going to be responsive to us if we're unregistered to vote. I shall never forget the day that when I was at A&T and I raised the question if there were 1,600 Aggies on this campus and they were unregistered to vote. And there are 20 people in a conference room and the 20 people are registered to vote. Where does the elected official go? Students all over the classroom argued, they should go to the 1,600, that's the crowd. No. The people who determine the destiny of that elected official are in the small conference room of 20 voters, not the 1,600 unregistered voters. When we register 1,600 people to vote, now the conference room becomes a smaller venue for the official, because the larger venue of 1,600 registered voters creates the responsiveness in the democracy. So, I challenge the students at Shaw today to achieve 100% voter registration. Be known amongst HBCU campuses as the leader of voter registration. Follow the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Registering to vote was a nonviolent thrust for which we might express ourselves in the democratic process. Politics without voting, without participation, can be a violent proposition. Dr. King, Reverend Forbes, Dr. Forbes, who introduced me today as well, and others, Cleve Sellers, here in North Carolina, who registered students to vote, who engaged in nonviolent direct action. We're looking for nonviolent means to participate in the system that we might express ourselves. And so, through voter registration, we are actually honoring the best of our legacy and the best of those who fought and died before us. But we must identify with that. It's really not just about 2020. It's about what happened in 2016. It's about what happened in 2012. It's about what happened in 2008. It's about what happened in 2004. There have been 45 presidents of the United States. There will be 45 more presidents of the United States. A Shaw student one day can be president of the United States. We have to think like that, and we have to act like that.
That's right. And you mentioned 2016. There's a great lesson to be learned from 2016, but some may not learn the key lesson. What do you think it is?
Wow, there's so many, and I must be candid with you. In 2016, I had just been released from a federal correctional institution after having served my country for 17 years in the Congress of the United States. And so I have a very different perspective going into 2016. I think about Democrats and Republicans who don't speak to the needs and the concerns of 68 million men and women who did what the judge said do. They did what the jury said do. They paid their debt to society. And yet within the state systems and within the federal systems, all too often, they are still sidelined on the side of society, and they are not brought back into the political process. Oh, no, no. You know, if I were with my mother, she would say, Jesse Jr., why do you keep going back to that experience? Because I can't let go of the families that I saw in the process. And I had a strong family to return to. And I can't let go of men that I saw in shame, in blame, and guilt. Not everyone was repentant, but the vast majority were. And I can't let go of the fact that I'm sitting here on this stage and I can still project. And many of them have been absorbed back into the society, and they won't even tell you what they've done. Many of them's new name is Reverend. Amen. Came out of prison and changed their lives, but they've never been forgiven. They've never been forgiven by the state of North Carolina, even though they paid their debt. They've never been forgiven by the President of the United States, even though they paid their debt. And we watch on a daily basis, Deborah, the President of the United States dangle forgiveness for people who are politically connected. What about your brother? What about your sister? What about your mother? What about your father? They paid their debt to society. They're not politically connected. And no one is dangling forgiveness in front of them. I'm going to change that.
How do you intend to change that?
I believe in spirit energy. I believe in one God with all my heart, soul, and my mind, and I believe in my neighbor as myself. That is the sum of my religion. I believe that every person is born within their star. And I believe that I can't ask anyone to do or make the contribution that I want to make. Everyone makes their contribution. But I plan to be an advocate for the forgiveness of men and women who paid their debt to society, because I believe that redemption and forgiveness on earth is at the foundation of my faith. Somewhere I read in a man who forgave a prostitute. Somewhere I read in a thief on a cross next to the master and a promise that was made to him. Somewhere I read that Saul of Tarsus can fall off of his horse, hit his head, and become the Apostle Paul. Somewhere I read that we have an obligation on a lonely road called Jericho to help people who have been beaten and robbed and stolen and had their legacies stolen from them, to restore them. I can't speak for the next life. At 53 years old, I shall get there soon enough to make a determination as to whether or not it is true. But what I do know in this system, the possibility of achieving that responsibility and that respect and that restoration and that redemption for American families is possible. It is nowhere else possible on earth than it is in this system. I believe this is the intent of the founding fathers. And I believe that I'm going to spend the rest of my life educating the American people on that as a fundamental, our first fundamental right, and that is the right to be forgiven once we make mistakes. That's how we change, I believe, the spirit energy of the nation.
And as you know, and a lot will admit, there's a lot of division in our nation right now. What can you say about what it takes and what needs to be the priority when it comes to coming together and also being empowered as people of color in order to achieve the dream?
When my father was active in the late 60s, early 70s, and mid 70s, there was a movement, Dr. Forbes, where black men and dashikis used to say, "Tell it like it is. Tell it like it is. Tell it like it is. Keep it real." But the challenge of leadership is not only to tell it like it is, but to tell it like it ought to be. And that's the challenge, to keep hope alive. I understand You got the is in the street corner better than me. I got that. I understand the is. You ain't been to prison. I got the prison thing down. I got that. I know what it is. Now let me tell you what it ought to be. We ought to dream of the day when these prisons are turned into museums and we don't warehouse our people like we're presently warehousing our people, and nonviolent offenders have alternatives to mass incarceration. We got to dream about it. We've got to dream about it just to see it, just to imagine the possibility. That ain't got nothing to do with the way it is. That's about the way it ought to be. So I think the challenge that we have is, I think my father probably said it best. We simply have to do our part to keep hope alive.
Keep hope alive. And it's a tremendous charge in the face of so much adversity, in the face of so much divisiveness in our nation. I can only imagine that a lot of people just see reason to be discouraged. And I've got colleagues and friends who are discouraged, were particularly discouraged on election night 2016.
Courage is a factor in leadership. It's easy to do a press conference with all supporters behind me, and mostly African American. But to reach out to women and to Jews and to Muslims and to gays and lesbians, and to project an image in a press conference that is reflective of who we are as Americans, to make sure that students are present. And that requires courage. It also requires some thought in terms of projection. I've learned that from my father. I learned that from Dr. King, that when he took nonviolent resistance not to the comfortable streets of Harlem, we had plenty of black leaders in Harlem talking about what black folks ought to do. But the road from Selma to Montgomery was not Harlem. Anybody can talk garbage on 145th and Lenox in front of Sylvia's restaurant. Anyone can talk about how black we are in front of a Soul Queen restaurant on 79th and Stony Island in Chicago. We can all talk about how much racial pride we have eating at Roscoe's Chicken and Waffles in Los Angeles. But Selma to Montgomery, man. Medgar Evers, Swerner Goodman and Cheney. Man, they took this thing right to the heart of insensitivity, to the heart of intolerance, and then they turned the other cheek in the face of it. There's a story of Dr. King, Deborah, in Chicago, and a woman came up to Dr. King, and not only was she cursing at him, she actually spit in his face, a white woman. And Dr. King did not react. He then turned to her and said, "I thought you too beautiful to behave the way you're behaving." And then he continued the march. He came back for his second march in Chicago, and the white woman joined the march. She said, "Dr. King, I felt so bad after you told me that I looked too beautiful to behave in the way I was behaving. I've been thinking about it ever since you said it, and I decided to what? Change my behavior." So he took the message of love and redemption directly to her, and he converted an enemy into a friend, and the same person became a supporter. That's not 147th and Lenox. That's Cicero in Chicago. And that is a very, very different courage under fire.
This is the last question I'll have for you today, and it pertains to our state. What do you see as the role of North Carolina heading into the next election?
I am impressed with North Carolina. Obviously, I attended college here between 84 and 87. I would love to live in North Carolina. I would love to work in North Carolina. I think that North Carolina is a state that is heading in a very, very progressive direction, in no small measure because of the educational institutions and the average education of the person in this state. The demographics are changing. I have a friend who teaches at a local high school, and they recently took some students to NC State to see the library, exposing children in high school to these institutions. Light bulbs are going off. They're being encouraged to take on the technology. They're being encouraged to consider the nursing school at A&T and the collaboration with UNCG. They're being encouraged by Shaw's technological developments and innovation. They're being encouraged as these light bulbs go off, as the people become more educated. Guess what happens? The statues go down. Silent Sam been sitting on UNC Chapel Hill's campus. It sat there for Sam Perkins. It sat there for James Worthy. It sat there for Michael Jordan. And here comes this generation saying, we've been playing football, we've been playing basketball, we've been eating together, we're going to live together, and we're tearing down these statues. There is a new North Carolina on the horizon.
Jesse Jackson. Jesse Jackson, thank you so much for your powerful words and your powerful charge to this audience, to all of us.
Thank you, Deborah.
Best wishes.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much. And thank you for joining us. I'm Deborah Holt-Noel.